Hi, so this is the second lecture of the deep learning course I'm teaching at EPFL this semester. This second lecture is about concepts in machine learning, so not stuff specific to deep learning, but which are quite fundamental, so mostly capacity, first defining what is machine learning, and then the notion of capacity, overfitting, underfitting, bias-variance dilemma. And in the end, we will see two very basic algorithms for embedding and clustering, which gives, I think, an idea of what we can expect from simple learning algorithms, and also it will motivate the deep learning type of processing, type of models. So what is learning from data? The general objective of machine learning is to capture regularity in data to make predictions. So we saw this regression example where we modeled the blood pressure from the age by using a linear model. And this is one case. This is maybe the simplest case, and the first one seen historically. But there are plenty of different types of inference, of prediction. So we can roughly split them into three categories, which correspond in practice to different techniques to use, especially in deep learning. So even though there are other variants, there are multiple types of inference, and this is a very crude way of organizing them. It's still quite convenient, because often we will describe different algorithms for those different three types of prediction. So the first type is classification, where you get an input signal and you want to predict a finite class, so a label. So for instance, in object recognition, it's the input signal would be an image, and the output would be a class number corresponding to one of the classes you have seen during training. In the case of cancer detection, the input signal would be whatever measurement you have access to, so it can be gene expression, or it can be microscopic images or others. And you have to predict one bit of information, which is there cancer or not. And another example would be speech processing, where the input would be a sound sample and the output could be either a phoneme or maybe a word. The second type of inference would be regression, where you similarly get an input signal and want to predict now a continuous quantity. So this can be, for instance, customer satisfaction. It's a score. And here, the notion of continuous quantity is not only that it takes values into a continuous space, but also that the structure, the Euclidean structure, or the topology of this continuous space makes sense. So usually, for instance, customer satisfaction, it makes sense that you have some notion of increasing value, so of monotonicity of the quantity. And then the third type of inference would be density estimation, where you do not now try to predict a single value, but really to capture the very structure of your data. So for instance, to do outlier detection. So given a bunch of examples, you want, given a new test point, you want to decide if it's very unlikely under your distribution or not. Or another quite standard example, and we will see this in one of the last courses, is for sampling and synthesis. So you want to synthesize new images or new sound which are realistic. So the standard way of formalizing machine learning and learning will be through a joint distribution over the observable quantities and the values to predict, except in the case of density estimation, where this would be only this distribution would be only over X. And then usually you have a training set, which is a bunch of pairs, IID pairs, so independent and identically distributed pairs, following the joint distribution, the true distribution of the data. So how can we interpret this joint distribution? So for classification, a way of envisioning mu of xy would be that first we sample y, we sample the class, and then given the class we sample the signal. So this is a very generative way of seeing things, like For instance, you first decide what object or animal is in the image, and then you paint it according to what is the true thing visible in it. Or it could be, for instance, you have the true phoneme, which is a A, and then you generate a sound according to this class. So this is a generative way of seeing it, but of course this is disputable. You could also say, no, there is a true distribution, which is all the cells, the distribution of images of cells, and then an expert is going to tell me if it's cancerous or not. But I think usually it's more convenient to see the classification, in the classification case, the joint distribution as you first generate the class and then you generate the signal. For regression, usually it's the other way around. You first generate the observation, and then you generate the value, the quantity to predict conditionally to the observable value. And in the simple case, the observable value will be a deterministic function of the value to predict will be a deterministic function of the observable value plus an independent noise. It's what for instance, we saw for the linear regression. F was linear and epsilon was a Gaussian noise centered. So now with this defined, we can more precisely define the three types of inference we introduced before. So for classification, xy is a random variable on. So in that case, I took x being a random vector of continuous values of dimension d, and the value to predict to be a class over 1c. So my pair xy take values over rd times 1c. And what you want to achieve for classification is to find, given an x, to find which is the most likely class corresponding to this signal. So argmax over y of posterior probability of y being y given x equal x. For regression, it makes sense that what you want to minimize, so again, the input signal would be a vector of dimension d. The value to predict is a continuous quantity, so this is open to discussion because you could perfectly want to predict higher dimension values. And it makes sense to try to estimate the conditional expectation of y given x, which would be the value which minimize L2 error to different realization of y given x. Again, we can perfectly build situations where this is not what you want to do. Maybe what you want to do is to predict very well the sum of the quantity near the target and not care about the one which are far off. So this would be robust when you want to have a robust loss. But this is more to give some concrete examples of what you may want to achieve in the more standard case. Again, all this is perfectly open to discussion. And for density estimation, x is now a random variable, again over vectors of dimension d, and what you want to estimate is directly the density itself. I insist on the fact that all this is perfectly debatable. So you perfectly imagine that your input, your visible signal is not a simple vector of dimension d, it's more complicated stuff. There could be discrete quantities or whatever. And you may have other objectives than what I describe here. But those are, say, the vanilla case, the simplest one. And the boundaries between those categories are unclear because, for instance, if you can do perfectly regression, you could do classification through the class scores, or you could just say I'm going to consider the class label as a continuous quantity and just do regression over it, which would be weird. But if you are able to do perfectly well regression, that would work. And of course, you could do, if you are able to do perfectly well density modeling, then you can do classification using Bayes' law. So those things are quite, from a mathematical perspective, those things are very unclearly defined. But in practice, we will see in this course that those three types of problems correspond to actual different types of practical methods. Even if they are mathematically very close, in practice they differ quite a lot. Coming back to the classification, there are two subclasses in classification. One is generative methods and the other one is the discriminative. So in the generative approach, you try to explicitly model the data distributions. And in the discriminative case, you just bypass it and directly try to learn a prediction rule. So we can make this a bit more concrete. Let's take the example of predicting the height of basketball player from the gender of basketball player from their height. So I took those numbers from the web, and those are the two Olympic teams, Brazilian Olympic teams from a certain year. I don't remember. And now I have 12 females and 12 males. And what I can do is to fit a Gaussian distribution over those two populations. So this is a Gaussian distribution corresponding to the height of female Brazilian basketball player, and this is a Gaussian distribution of the height of male Brazilian basketball player. And now, using those two distributions, I can use Bayes' law. So it's simply that the probability of the gender being G given H being is H is simply the probability for H to be what it is given the gender equal G times the prior of the gender divided by a normalization quantity. And if I plot this curve now, I get this curve. So the x-axis is the height, and the y-axis is the probability to be male under this model. And as expected, if you are very short, you are more likely to be a female. If you are very tall, you are more likely to be a male. And there is a cut point, and here we can note that basketball players are indeed tall, because the cut, so the height for which there is half probability to be a male and half probability to be a female, is 1 meter 89 centimeters, which is quite tall. So here this is a generative approach where we have designed a model of the classes, a model of the signal under the two classes. But we can be more direct, and instead of going through this model, we can say, I don't care about all this. What I care is just to make a prediction. So what I can do is my expert knowledge. So in the generative model, my expert knowledge, my prior model is that the two distributions are Gaussian. Here I could say my prior knowledge is that a predictor that just cut, so a predictor that predicts greater than rho is male, lesser than rho is female. And now I have to fix my rho parameter. What I can do is simply, if my rho parameter is very small, I predict all the time male, so my number of error is 12, because there are 12 females in my training set. If my rho threshold is very high, I'm predicting always female, so I'm making 12 errors on the training set because I'm wrong on all the males. And now in the middle I have a sweet spot, which is at 1 meter 87 centimeter. I minimize my number of errors, I make 3 mistakes. And we can see that even though the class of models is quite different, because here there is no density model of any sort, the cut is quite similar, because it was 1 meter 89 centimeters, here it's 1 meter 87 centimeters, so it's very similar. In that case, it's harder to design a confidence indicator. So with the first approach, we are quite happy, because we have the sense that we actually get a posterior probability, and even though the meaning of this quantity is strongly related to the Gaussian model I have over my height, it's still quite reassuring. It's still, in practice, if your posterior is 0.999, you are very likely to be a male, and if your posterior is 0.001, you are very likely to be a female. Here it's not that clear. We still have this same sort of indication from a geometric perspective by saying if I'm far away from the threshold, I'm more likely to be whatever, a male if I am on the positive side, on the large height side, and the female on the other case. So we come to the notion of risk and empirical risk. So learning consists of finding a set of functionals, a good one. So we defined a big F, which is the set of all the functions, all the mappings that our training procedure may produce. And we want to find in this big F a F star which is good, which does what it's supposed to do. So there are two things. The first thing is that this big F contains all the possible functional that your algorithm may produce. So when you have fixed the architecture of your neural network, for instance, this F contains all the possible parameter configurations and the resulting mappings. So it's really huge. It's a continuous set. It's a submanifold in a space of functional. It's infinite in a continuous sense. And the second thing that we define the notion of being good through something called the loss, which is a functional that takes as input a function on the training example and return a value which is large with, when f does not do a good job and small when f does a good job. So LFZ increases with how wrong f is on z. We want L, the loss, to be small. And now we can give three examples. So for classification, a reasonable loss would be the number of mistakes, or is it making a mistake on this sample or not. So the loss of f on the pair xy is 0 if f is predicting the proper class, and 1 if it's not. For regression, it could be, as we did for the linear, our example of linear regression, the quadratic error. So the square of the difference between the prediction you are making on x and the training value at x. And for density estimation, and we'll come back to this later, it can be a minus log of q of z. So it makes sense because if your density is accumulating mass on the training point, this tend to be large, this tend to be large, and this tend to be, with the minus in front, it tends to be small. Something we will see later is that the loss may include additional terms related to f itself. So here, the loss depends only on the response of f, but we may sometimes add quantities which are related to the structure of f itself. For instance, how big are the parameters, or what is the curvature, or stuff like that. Usually it's for regularization, where you have a prior knowledge about how f should behave and you want to force your optimization to go there. So now with this loss defined, we are looking for an f which minimizes expected risk, which is the expected expectation of the loss when your data follow the real distribution of z. So ideally what we would do is to pick an f star such that on average, for the true average, the loss is small, where the true average of the loss is called the expected risk. So this is vocabulary from the machine learning field. And of course this quantity is unknown because you don't have access to the true distribution of your training data, of the true distribution of z. But what you usually have is a bunch of training examples, z1, zn, z1, zn, which are independent and identically distributed following mu z, the true distribution. And from this, what you can do is to compute an estimator of the risk, which is we call the empirical risk. So the empirical risk of f for the training data d is the expectation, the expectation under d of the expectation on d, the empirical expectation on d of the loss, which is 1 over n, the sum over the sample of the loss on each sample. So an important thing is that this is what we call an unbiased estimator. If you compute the expectation of the empirical risk, you just replace the empirical risk by its expression, which is 1 over n sum over the sample of the loss. Then you use the linearity of the expectation, which puts the 1 over n in front and the sigma outside, and you get the expectation of the loss for a single sample. Because the sample follows the true distribution, you can put here the expectation under the true z, because the zn follows the same distribution as z. And now you end up with the result that the expectation of the empirical risk is expected risk. So we are happy to have this, but it's not such a strong result, because what matters is actually the variance. For instance, if you had a single training example, this would still hold. So we are happy. The expected empirical risk is expected risk, but okay, it's a good thing, it's true, but it's not sufficient to make stuff work. We would need to have a strong small variance of this estimator to be happy. So now all this is being defined. So we have a training set big D, a functional space big F, and a loss L. Learning just aims at computing f star equal argmin of r hat of the empirical risk over the functional, the set of functional. So you want to pick the F that minimizes your empirical risk. So now 2 questions. The first one is, can we bound the true risk with the empirical risk? So if you give me an F, is this a reasonable estimator? So here, the important stuff is that it's F, it's not F star. So this F is independent from D. It's really like somebody builds the F and somebody else samples the data, and you're estimating RF with R star of FD. Here it's reasonable. You can do this because it's a standard estimation problem. You just get a bunch of values and take the average, how close the average of a bunch of values is from the true expectation, the true expected value. So yes, here you can. You just have to control the variance. It's usual stuff. So the real question, which is more difficult, is can we bound R of F star with R hat of F star D? So it's really, you look at the data, you pick the best F, and now you look according to the risk. So you pick the F that minimizes empirical risk. Is the empirical risk a reasonable estimator of the risk? Unfortunately, not simply. So you cannot bound simply RF star with R hat F star D. In practice, what does it mean? It means that you cannot bound your test error, the real error of your regressor, of your predictor, with the error you saw during training. You can get some result if you have additional constraints on F. So for instance, a trivial result would be if you have a single mapping in F, of course you can, because this stuff would not take into account the data. It would be F star would be independent from D because it would be a deterministic quantity. It would not depend on D. And there are a bunch of ways of doing real math and really bounding RF star with R hat F star D, but it's not something we will see in detail in the course. And I will say we will see a little bit in this lecture how all those things are articulating with each other, the F and R hat and R. Note that in practice we call loss both the functional itself, that to a mapping on the training example give a value, and the empirical risk, so the empirical value expectation of this quantity over the training examples that we minimize during training. Okay, so 2 very important concepts is overfitting and underfitting. And we'll first go through a simple example to get an intuition of what it is. So imagine you want to hire a candidate for a position, and you evaluate how good are candidates by asking them 10 technical questions which have binary answers. Now imagine that somebody shows up at your office and you interviewed her, and she makes a perfect score, so she answers perfectly well the 10 questions. Would you feel confident that she's a strong candidate? Probably yes. Now imagine that 10 candidates show up at your office, and you interview them, and you pick the best. So now we pick the one that did the best on this test. Would you feel confident that this candidate is actually good? Now let's go a bit even further, and let's say you interview 1,000 candidates. So now you have to picture this. There is a room, 1,000 candidates are passing the test. Each of them is producing 10 bits of information, and you pick the one that has a higher score. Would you feel confident that if you pick the one who gets a higher score, he or she would be actually a good candidate for the position? So we can make this a bit more mathematical by taking the following model. Imagine that I have 1,000 candidates answering the 10 questions. So n is a candidate number, k is a question number. So I'm going to model this. I think I have 1,000 candidates that reply completely at random. So they flip a coin for every question. Now if I do the math, the probability for one candidate to do a perfect score is 1 over 1024, so it's 2 to the power 10. And now if we look at the probability that at least one of the candidates among the 1,000 answers perfectly, we get 62%. So to summarize, if you have 1,000 candidates for your position, and they answer 10 binary questions, and they answer completely at random with flipping a fair coin, you would end up with a probability 62% that one of the candidates will do a perfect job, while he is a completely random individual, according to this test, at least. So it's quite intuitive that if you select a candidate based on a statistical estimator, you cannot trust the said statistical estimator for this candidate. It connects to the training problem. So here, our space of functionals are the candidates. You want to pick some stuff that will do good prediction, basically that on questions for which you do not have the answer, it will do a good job, it will work well in your office. On the training examples you have, for which you have the answers, are those 10 questions. And here we get a clear feeling that if the number of candidates is high, so if you really optimize something which has a lot of degrees of freedom, but you optimize this according to a criterion that is a bit restricted from informational perspective, then you are doing something completely wrong. And this is at the core of machine learning. So this notion of the amount of information you have at your disposal to judge the quality of something has to be large in front of the freedom of choice you have for this thing you want to select. And basically what I'm going to talk about for now in this course is how to put this in a more precise framework. So first we can get a more clear intuition on a very simple algorithm which is called the k-nearest neighbor, and is often the baseline for many experiments. So the k-nearest neighbors is defined as follows. So imagine you have a bunch of training examples. So here I'm considering the classification case where xn is a continuous quantity, so it can be again sound, an image, whatever. And the class takes values to see possible class values. And the one nearest neighbor, so for k equal 1, prediction rule is very simple. If you get a new x, you take the xn which is the closest, so n star of x is the index of the training example whose x is the closest to our new x. And then our prediction f star of x is going to be the label of this closest example. So here I'm making a lot of assumptions. For instance, I'm making the assumption that all the xn are different. Otherwise, here that would be a bit ambiguous. But we take here it's really to give us a feeling of an intuition of what's going on. If we want to make this more precise, we would have to be more careful. But I won't be too careful here. Okay, so the one nearest neighbor is simply you have a bunch of training examples, and when you get a new x, you take the training example whose x is the closest to the test x, and your prediction for this new x is the label of the closest training example. So now imagine I have 3 training examples in the plan, so 2 dimension. This would be my prediction. So if I take an x here, is the closest to the red dot, so I would predict red. Here I would predict red. Here I would predict blue. And we see the shape of so-called Voronoi cells, which are the transition where you go from the domain where the closest to red to the domain where the closest to blue. Okay. So undermine the assumptions of regularities of the true distribution of the data. When the number of training examples tend to infinity, the asymptotic error rate of this very, very simple rule is less than twice the optimal Bayes error rate. So Bayes error rate would be the best you can do. It's to predict according to the true posterior probability under the density. This is the best you can do in principle. And here, surprisingly, this very naive rule would do only twice worse than the optimal Bayes error rate. There is a more stable version of the k-nearest neighbor, which is instead of predicting the label of the closest training example, you look at the k closest ones, that's the name of the algorithm, and you look at the dominant vote. So what is the class the most frequent among the k closest example, and this will be your prediction. And in that case, if you consider the k-nearest neighbor, if you let n goes to infinity, so you have more and more training points, and you also let k increase, but not as fast as n, so basically n would increase at a certain speed, and k would increase roughly at the square root of n, which means you look at a larger and larger neighborhood, but that proportionally does not grow as fast as the full population. In that case, the error rate of the k-nearest neighbor is the actual optimal Bayes error rate. It's simply that eventually in the end, because n goes to infinity, because k does not grows slower than n, you end up looking at counting the stuff in a smaller and smaller neighborhood, but you have more and more points to do this counting, so you get closer and closer to the actual bias posterior. So we can visualize all this with an example in the plan again. So here I have a bunch of training points, which are the little circle and the little black dots. The true class is illustrated with this red disk, which the points are of class 1 inside, 0 outside. And if I apply my one nearest neighbor rule, this is my prediction, which makes sense. It's a bit weird, the boundary, because if points are missing, so for instance here I have not many points, this guy, for instance, is closest to the white and to the black, it's close to class 0 than class 1, so you would pick class 0. It's the same around here, you have weird stuff going on. Now we can take a more complicated situation where there is actually noise in the labels. So now the class is not a deterministic function of x, you have a flip noise, in which case k nearest neighbor, the one nearest neighbor, would do this. So what we can do is to look at what would be the ideal k to do the best prediction. So here, again, this is my training example. So I have a flip noise on the label, so I have some black dots among the white circle, and the white circle around the black dots. And what I can do is to optimize k to do a good job. So here I did optimization over another set, and I get that the best I can do is k equal 51. Okay. So here what I'm showing here is a shade of gray corresponding to the number of votes. If you go to a point, you look at the 51 closest training example, and you count how many of them are of class 1. So perfect white would be they are all of class 0. Sorry. Perfect black would be they are all of class 1. And we see that it gets darker in the center, inside the disk, and lighter outside. And actually, so now I threshold the vote. If I put a cut at 20, then I get this far better prediction. So again, here we do not have any more little holes on the horrible shape of around the disk. But what is problematic in this is that now consider that if the ground truth, if the true structure of the data was that you are of label 1 inside those two disks and label 0 outside, still with noise, and we use the same k that was working so well on the single disk situation. Now what happens is we forget this guy. Why? Because here all those points inside have more class 0 training examples in their neighborhood of 51 closest then they have an example of class 1. And it's here we are facing a philosophical issue, which is if I show you those data, forget here you are God, so you see the red disk, but imagine you do not have access to the red disk. You could perfectly have a cluster of ones par pure luck, so this could be completely flip noise. So it's very hard, here you have to make a decision, at which point you consider structure is noise, at which point you consider structure is actual structure. And here by just setting the k to 51, we completely discard the structure and we do false negatives, so-called false negatives, which is to respond incorrectly that those were of class 0, while there should be of class 1. And we can illustrate this with this following graph, where on the x-axis I plot k, and for all those values of k, I'm running the experiment, so I'm computing the training and the test error. If k equal 1, of course, the training error, which is shown in green, goes to 0, because of course, if you take a 1 nearest neighbor on the training examples, you do the best, you do 0 error rate, because you always predict the right label. And the more we increase k, the more we are averaging in a larger neighborhood, the more the training error goes up. For the test error, the situation is slightly more complicated, because if k is very large, you do bad because you basically do not take into account the location of x, because you are averaging over, you are taking the dominant label over the full training set. At some point, you have the ideal neighborhood size, which balance very well between the noise and the actual scale of the true structure in the data. And when you start to be even more adapted to the training set, what happens is called overfitting, where you start to model the noise in the data, the training data, instead of modeling the actual structure of the training data. So this regime is called underfitting, this regime is called overfitting. This axis here can be seen as, on this side you are not flexible at all, so your prediction, your learning algorithm does not care about the training data. On the other side, it cares too much about the training data. On this side, you are not modeling anything. On this side, you are modeling the noise in the training data. So again, underfitting and overfitting. So we can illustrate the same notion with a slightly more complicated class of models by considering polynomial regression. So what is polynomial regression? Consider a space of functional which are polynomials, so f of x parameterized by alpha, which is a vector of plus 1 values. The value of f at x is the standard polynomial expression, so the sum for degree equals 0 to big D of alpha d xd. Given a bunch of training points, which are pairs of real values, we want to minimize during training the quadratic loss, so the quadratic discrepancy between the value we get on each sample and the target value, so the sum of the square of this difference. So here what I do is replace f by its expression, which is just the value of the polynomials at xn. And what is very nice is that this quantity, the sum of the square of these values, can be rewritten as the square of the L2 norm of these differences. So it makes sense because if you multiply this matrix by this vector, the first you get a vector whose first coefficient is going to be alpha 0 x10 plus alpha 1 x11 plus alpha 2 x12, etc. So you will get the value when you do the product of those two things, you get a vector whose first value is the value of f at x1, the second value is the value of f at x2, etc. And when you take the difference with y1, yn, you get value of f at x1 minus x1 plus the second index would be value of f at x2 minus y2, etc. And when you take the square of the L2 norm, you get the sum of the squares of those values. So that's very nice because it means that now minimizing this, so finding the alpha that minimizes that loss, can be cast as a standard quadratic minimization problem for which we have efficient algorithms. It's something interesting in the sense that here we are talking about polynomials on the L2 norm, and it looks like quite hairy, but it's very, very simple. It's like simply quadratic, minimizing a quadratic problem. So in PyTorch, how we would do this? So again, we want to compute this guy. We want to find the alpha that minimizes a matrix that is the deterministic quantity of the training points. This is stuff you want to optimize, and this is also coming from your training examples. So here I'm writing a little procedure that does this. It gets as parameter, at argument, the degree of the polynomial you want to learn, you want to optimize, the x, which is this column, the values of x, and y, which are the target values. So what we do is just first to say that n is a number of training examples. Then we build a big tensor, which is this guy, so it has as many rows as there are training examples, as many columns as degrees plus 1. Then we fill this matrix with the proper quantity, so we want to make this. So we go through all the degrees, which are all the columns, and for each column we put in it the vector x power d. So this will return a column vector, which is just all the terms has been put to the power d. And then I also build a y, which is the same y I got as parameter, but I reshape it as a vector of n row of one column. And then we call the gods of LAPACK. We just say, okay, return me back an alpha such that x times alpha is as close as possible to y in a quadratic sense. And this is a quantity or a field polynomial return. So here there is a weirdness. I've exchanged some mails with the Torch developers. I'm not clear, but you have to narrow. So the alpha returned by generalized like this square of LAPACK in PyTorch should be of degree the number of columns of x, but it's actually it's larger, and I'm not clear about what are the remaining values. But so here I narrow to the d+1 values, and that's correct. So now I can take a very simple example to show how to use this fit polynomial function. What I do is to generate an x which is regularly dispatched between minus pi and pi, and I just say that y is the sign value of x. So here x is a column value containing 100, is a column vector, it's a vector containing 100 values between minus pi and pi, and y is a vector containing the sign values corresponding to this x. Now I call my fit polynomial with degree d, which is 4, so when I'm arrive here, I have the 5 coefficients corresponding to the coefficients of a polynomial of degree 5 that mimics, that is as close as possible to the sign function between minus pi and plus pi, as estimated with the quadratic error over 100 samples. And here what I do is simply to look at the test value. So here I regenerate the same, a big x corresponding to the small x, and I compute the z value. So z now would be the value of f, of the value of the polynomial that my fitting procedure has estimated over the training points. And here I'm just looping, so I plot the x, the true values, and the predicted value. And if I plot this now with a new plot, I get this. So the red curve is the true sign, and the blue curve is my polynomial regression. If you take degree 5, it does such a perfect job that we would not even see here on this graph the difference. So now what we can do is to use this polynomial regression model on synthetic example with noisy training points to illustrate how the prediction changes when we increase the degree of the regularization. So let's be concrete. So here my true f, so you have a true structure in the world, which is a thin line, and I get training examples which are noisy. So my x are regularly spaced, but the y, I generate this training set by putting a random Gaussian noise over each of the target value. And now, if I fit a polynomial of degree 0, I get this guy, of course, because this blue line is the polynomial of degree 0, so it's a constant mapping, which goes as best as it can through the red dots, which are the training points. If I take degree 1, I get this guy, degree 2, I get this guy, degree 3, I get this guy. We start to be happy, degree 4, we are happy. And here we see that some stuff goes wrong. So we get lines, we get polynomials that indeed maybe go better through the dots, but which start to diverge from the true structure, the true underlying structure of the data. And 7 degrees, 8, 9, and at 9 degrees it completely diverges. Why? Because we have 10 training points, and the polynomial of degree 9 has 10 coefficients, so we perfectly fit the training points. We see that we go through all of them. There is some weird stuff in the lines, but this is Gnuplot doing this, and I have no idea why. It's weird. But here, so we do a perfect job of the training set, again, because we have 10 coefficients, and so the optimization found the 10 values for the coefficient that makes the polynomial go exactly through the training points, but we are completely off the true structure of the space, which is this thin line. And we can, similarly as we did for k-nearest neighbor, we can plot this graph where the green line is the training error, the red line is the test error, the x-axis is flexibility of our space, so which for the k-nearest neighbor was k, was modulated by k, and for the polynomials is the degree. So if the degree is 0, we have no flexibility at all. We do badly on train and test, but we do the same. If we increase the degree, we are more and more able to fit the data, and with the degree very high, here it's a log scale, so actually the error rate goes to minus infinity. But it's actually the L2 error is 0, and the test error start to increase. Yeah, maybe what it's important is that the test error is estimated over a test set which has been generated with different noise in the y, on different x actually. So here what happens, exactly as for the nearest neighbor, we start to have a gap between the test error and the train error, because the train error has modeled, because the training has modeled the noise in the training error, in the training set, sorry, which is not the same as the noise in the test set. So again, this is underfitting. We don't fit even the training data, but we don't fit the noise. And this is overfitting, where we do perfect job in training, but we do some crazy stuff in test because we have fitted the noise in the training data, which is not the same as the noise in the test data. So maybe to illustrate this even more, here what I do is to regenerate different training sets just by having different noise over the Ys, and for each of them I fit one polynomial. So here each blue line corresponds to a polynomial fitted on a different training set with a different noise. And what we see is that here with degree 0 they are kind of concentrated, they are all very close to each other. Degree 1 it starts to diverge a little bit, degree 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and at degree 9 we see that this flexibility, this fitting to noise that we observe can be seen more precisely in the fact that through different runs, through different training sets and different noise, we have a strong variance, we have a strong divergence between different runs of the training. So different training set leads to very different predictors. And we agree that's not good. So if you are training something to predict the stock market, and if you train it over a year 2001, 2002, 2003, you get one type of a certain predictor, and if you train it over 3 different other years, you get a completely different predictor, you would be very uncomfortable. It really means that this has not captured the structure common to both training sets. And this is exactly what we observe here. So we can reformulate the control over the degree. So here what we were playing with was the degree of the polynomials. We can reformulate this control by saying that it's actually as if the loss was the quadratic loss plus a penalty term which is infinite as soon as we have non-zero coefficients for a monome of degree strictly greater than d. So it's just a formal way of expressing this. Instead of saying I'm going to consider polynomials of degree 0, 1, 2, 3, etc. I can say I'm considering all the polynomials of whatever degree, but I add to my loss, I have my first part of my loss is the same, it's a quadratic error, but I have a second loss, which is the penalty over the function itself, and which is plus infinity as soon as there is a monome of degree strictly greater than d, which is non-zero. So it's expressed here. And this motivates the use of more subtle variants. So now we can keep this form, saying, okay, I'm going to keep my quadratic error, which is a term that tells me if I fit the data or not. But that was a bit brutal. That was as soon as something is, as soon as a monome shows up greater than d, I just destroy everything. I penalize the function. I refuse to take it. Here I'm putting something more, a bit more gentle, which is I'm adding a penalty term, which is the sum of the square of the coefficients. So it's a bit the same stuff. You are, instead of constraining into a box of where you have a sharp edge, where as soon as the coefficient is non-zero and greater than d, you kill the function. Here there is a strong smooth slope that tend to prefer functionals closer to 0. And now that's nice because it's still quadratic. In the end, we had this quadratic stuff that we minimize with as a quadratic linear problem. And I won't show it here, but it's quite trivial that this just add some terms in your matrix, and it's exactly the same stuff. In the end, you can call LAPACK, and you would solve the same problem. And now what we can do is to look at the same little graphs where we plot different the result of the fitting over different training set. But now we are going to make the penalty of this, the weight of this penalty term goes down. So at first it's very heavy. So here all the polynomials during all the fits, they want really strongly to be close to 0, to have all the monome coefficients close to 0. And if I make my rho go to 0, so I make it smaller and smaller, I'm going to divide it by 10 in every graph, we see that now the polynomials can start to have greater coefficients for the monomes. They have more freedom to expand and to map to go to different polynomials, and we see that they expand, and the more I reduce rho, the more I get the same kind of behavior, which is through different training sets they behave differently. Okay. So here rho is 10 to the power minus 13, which is basically does not count anymore, and if I put it to 0, I go back to the result I had with a standard control over the degree. So here, because those are computers and not mathematics, I had to bound the degree. So in those experiments, the degree was at maximum 9. There were 10 modems, and I was playing with all. So I can plot exactly the same curve as I did before. Again, in green, the training error, in red, the test error. And the x-axis now is rho, so with rho very small, I'm letting the polynomials do whatever it wants. With rho very large, I tend to push the learning toward polynomials with all the monoms, with all the coefficients 0. And again, if rho is very strong, I don't, the training is not influenced by the training data, so of course it behaves the same in train and test. And the more you let the polynomial be flexible and do whatever it wants, the more the training error goes down, because at some point you will go through all the training points, and the more the test error goes up, because now you start to model the noise and you model the true structure of the data. So we define the capacity of a set of predictors, its ability to model an arbitrary functional. So we would say that a set of predictors has a large capacity if it's very flexible. It can fit the data very well. This is a vague definition and it's difficult to make formal. There is a mathematically precise notion, which is the Vapnik-Chervonenkis dimension, and so it's a very powerful concept. In the binary case, for instance, it's the number, the cardinality of the training set that the largest training set that you can label arbitrarily with the functional from F. So it's quite intuitive. It's a worst case. It's if you can label arbitrarily, if you have a bunch of 1 million x's that you can label arbitrarily with the function from your F, you get a feeling that it's very it's able. It has a lot of flexibility. It can really fit anything. So it's a very powerful concept, but it's poorly adapted to neural networks. I won't speak any more about it in this course, but really, if you are interested in the theoretical aspect of learning, this is extremely cool. This is a very, very powerful concept. So even though capacity is hard to define formally, it's quite clear in practice how to modulate it for given class of models. So you can either reduce it by reducing the space F itself. So we will see that for deep learning, if you remove some modules in your deep network, you reduce the capacity. Or you can also not push the optimization to the end, which means that given that you start from a point, you don't let the learning process reach a very large space of functions. You can also make the choice of FR less dependent on data. So with penalty coefficients, and it's something that is used even in deep learning. There are other ways you can do what is margin maximization. You consider geometric criterion to push your function away from the training point. Or you can do something else, which is to train a bunch of Fs and to take the average. This is a very powerful strategy. We can provide a nice analysis of this behavior that when we increase capacity, the predictor fits the data very well in training and does a poor job generalizing to test data. So let's come back to the example where we were fitting multiple polynomials of increasing degrees. And here I plot it slightly differently. So instead of fitting just 10 of them, I fitted 1,000 of them. And I computed for at every point the average response of those 1,000 fitted polynomials and the standard deviation of those 1,000 fitted polynomials. And what we see that for degree 0, as expected, the average one is constant and the standard deviation is pretty reduced. And when we increase the degree, so we get a linear, quadratic. And what we see is that the resulting prediction gets more and more aligned with the true value of the functional. So it gets the blue line, which is the average response of the predictor we have fitted, gets more and more right on the red line, but the standard deviation increases more and more. And here it's okay. Here the blue line is not on the red line anymore; it's less, but it's really due to the standard deviation being so large, which means that even by fitting 1,000 polynomials, I was still not able to have a stable expectation. And we can do the same with the penalty over the quadratic penalty over the coefficients. And similarly, when the capacity increases, the prediction, the average prediction align very well with through the structure of the data, while the standard deviation increases. So there is more and more variations through the training sets. So for different training sets, we get different predictors. And so this can be analyzed mathematically. So let's x be a fixed value, a real value, and let y be the true value to predict. So f of x, f being the underlying mapping that we would like to approximate. Let big Y be f star of x, where f star is the polynomial we have fitted, or the function we have fitted. And because the function we fit depend on the training set, and because the training set is a random quantity, big Y is a random quantity. Okay, so x is fixed, small y is the target value, the true value we would like to approximate, and the big Y is the value that our train predictor predicts at x, and it's a random quantity because the training set is random in this context. So now if we look at the expected value under D, so when we average across multiple an infinite great number of training sets, if we look at the quadratic error between the predicted value and the target value, we can expand this expression, we get this. Then we use the linearity of the expectation and we get that, so it's trivial. Then we introduce those two terms which kill each other, so the expectation, the square of the expectation of y under D. And now what we get is that this quantity is equal to this term, which is the square of the difference between the target value and the expected prediction across all those training sets, plus the variance of the prediction across all those training sets. So this is called the bias, and this is called the variance. So this is the bias variance decomposition. The bias term quantifies how much the model fits the data on average, and the variance term quantifies how much the prediction fluctuates across data sets. This decomposition means that if you increase one, if you want to decrease one, if you say, okay, I'm going to decrease the variance, you have to increase the bias. And so we can look at those two quantities on experiments with the polynomial. So the dark blue corresponds to the result when we modulate the degree, and the light blue is when we modulate the penalty over the quadratic penalty over the coefficients. And what we see is indeed that when we decrease the bias, we increase the variance, and conversely, when we decrease the variance, we increase the bias. So this corresponds, reducing the variance corresponds to reducing the capacity. If we have less capacity in F, so for instance, if we limit the degree, or if we make a strong penalty of the coefficients, we reduce the capacity and the variance is reduced, because your predictor depends less and less on the data, but the bias increases, because even on average you don't fit the real structure of the data. If you increase the capacity, the variance explodes, but now you fit very well the data on average. So can we give a more probabilistic meaning to all this? So conceptually, model fitting and regularization can be interpreted as Bayesian inference, which means that instead of having a bit of an arbitrary decision about prior and what regularization and what is the parameterization of your model, you can take another view where you make the assumption that your data actually follow a model, and that the parameters of this model are random quantities following a prior distribution. And then you use Bayes' law. So given the data you actually observed, what you can do is to estimate a posterior distribution over the parameters. So this way of doing things is slightly more intellectually satisfying, because instead of just coming with a recipe, you come with a model of your data, which is more scientific in some way. It's more, you make a guess about how the data behave, more than just saying, oh, I'm going to fit this because I have no reason except that it looks good to me. And also it may give you a posterior over the parameters of your model, which is also more satisfying, because it may give you some information about how accurate, how confident you may be in your predictions. So let's, for instance, consider the following model, where yn is a polynomial expression of xn plus noise. So in practice, what we have is that the xn follows the prior distribution mu of x. The noise are a bunch of independent Gaussian centered of standard deviation sigma, and the coefficients of the polynomials are independent normal distributions of standard deviation xi. So the AD, the xn, and the delta n are all independent quantities. This is whatever it wants. Everything else is Gaussian of different, so the noise and the polynomial coefficients have different standard deviations. And then what we observe is this expression. So it's a polynomial expression plus the noise. And for clarity, we will use A for the vector of the polynomial coefficients. And big D is the training set, and small d is the realization of the training set. So this is a random variable. So now from this, what we can get is that the log of the probability of certain set of parameters for the model given what we observed, we use Bayes' law. Then we just use, we put this guy, because it does not depend on alpha, which is what we are optimizing, we put it in a constant. We use the log for the two others, so the log of the product is the sum of the logs. Here we replace this by the actual quantity, because the data points are independently sampled. The joint probability, the joint density of all the data training set is the product of the probabilities of individual pairs given the parameters. And here we use the chain rule, so this guy is equal to this product, but here the xn are independent from the a's, so this is mu of xn. And what we get in the end is the following. And so we push this guy into the constant. So in the end, we get something which seems quite reasonable, which is that the probability for a certain set of parameters of the model underlying the data increases, the log of the probability increases with the log of the product of the probabilities of the points given the values, the mapping take at x given x on the parameters, plus the log of the prior over the parameters. And if we replace those expressions by our actual model, which are Gaussians, we get what we expect. The log of a Gaussian is the L2 error, the square error divided by the standard deviation, and the same for the prior and the A's. So we get in the end that the log of the probability for certain parameters given the training data is composed of the sum of the quadratic error of the fit plus a quadratic error, a quadratic penalty over the coefficient. You have a minus in front of both. And what is quite interesting is that if now you take rho equals sigma square over xi square, we go back to quadratic penalty over the coefficient. And all this is pretty reasonable. So in the end, if you have a strong prior over the parameters of your model, you need a lot of evidence to deviate from them. So here the prior was that they were centered on 0, and how strong they are centered on 0 was parameterized by the standard deviation xi. So we see that the smaller is xi, so the more peaked is your prior over the parameter, the more this term will matter, and the more you will need evidences, the more you will be far off from the target to accept to change your parameter, and the other way around. So that's usually we won't use this for deep learning, which is not as Bayesian as other subfield of machine learning, but it's still quite interesting intellectually to keep in mind that regularization can often, if not always, be cast as a Bayesian inference, which is you have a true model, you make the assumption that your data actually following the model, and that the parameters of the model follow prior distribution, and from this you can derive the actual loss you want to optimize. So now we come to the evaluation protocols themselves, which are quite central in machine learning. So the first remark is that learning algorithms, and in particular deep learning algorithms, require the tuning of many metaparameters. So in deep learning, as we will see, you have the number of layers of a network, the number of filters, size of the filters, and also even the optimization procedures have their own parameters. And these parameters have a strong impact on the performance, which results in a meta-overfitting through experiments. So not only your model can overfit the data because it has too much capacity, But also you may overfit your data because you are going to work for months over one training set, and you are going to fit and to tune and to change your architecture and to change your optimizer until you get good results. And so we must be extra careful with performance estimation in this context. So here, this is a simple example where I used the little piece of code I showed you last time on the previous lecture, and I just run it 100 times on NIST. So I just restarted my optimization from a network whose weights were randomized. I did this 100 times, so it's exactly the same piece of code, same data set, same everything, but the only difference is that the initialization of the weights of the network depends from one experiment to the other. And if I take the median test error, I get 1%. If I take the worst, it's 1.3% error rate, and the best is 0.82. That's quite large because this is the value you report in an article or a report, it looks far better than this. I mean, you have a relative improvement of close to 20%. So even though the code is exactly the same, it's just pure random fluctuation. So this, in practice, means that you have to be careful with the protocol. So the ideal development cycle would be following. You write a piece of code, you write your network, you train it, you test it, and you write your paper or report, whatever, where you report the error you got. In practice, maybe it's more like this. So you write your code, you train, maybe it crashes or it spits out not a numbers everywhere, so you go back to your code, maybe it gives it's a two-class problem and you get 80% error, so you fix your code, now you get 60%, you play a bit. At some point you do 0% training error, you're happy, you test, okay, you have overfitted, now you're at 20% error rate, but you're happy, it's what you report. And you are an honest person, that's fine. As long as you go back, you test on the train set and you look at the performance on the train set and you go back fixing your code, you're fine. You can trust the test performance. It may be overfitting, but if you're overfitting in this box on your training set, it's your problem, as long as you report in the paper the test error, in the report the test error. But unfortunately, it often does not look like this. It more looks like that. So what you do is that you have the NIST training set and the NIST test set, and if your test error is bad, you go back fixing your code, and that's quite bad because this value you are going to report in the end as overfitted. They have this meta overfitting. You have tuned your code, your piece of source, until you got reasonable results on the test set. So this should be avoided at all costs. You should really not use extensively the test set to tune your algorithm. The standard strategy is to actually have a third set called the validation set. So you train on the train set, estimate performance and validation, and you go back to your code. And in the end only, you are going to test on the test set and report the performance. When data is scarce, you can use what is called cross-validation, where you take away a small part of the training set and use it as the test set and repeat. So you could split, for instance, your training set into 10 parts. You train over 9 of them and test over the 10th, and you repeat. You redo this 10 times using successively each one of those 10 parts as a test set. Unfortunately, of course, doing this reduces the variance of your estimator, of your test error, because you are reusing the same stuff again and again, and there is no unbiased estimator of the variance of cross-validation. Even worse maybe on some data sets, because they have been used by thousands of researchers over millions of experiments in hundreds of papers, the overall process may look more like that. You write the code, train, optimize, test, optimize, do this again, publish the paper, and then the paper is taken back by somebody else who optimizes the code. And so NIST typically is right, probably strongly has been overfitted by the whole community for years now. So it's hard to know if the 0.21% error rate is actually meaningful, or if it's simply a meta overfitting. We can list what are the ways of cheating in machine learning, so which are things we actually look at in practice. The first is early evaluation stopping, which is that you are developing your stuff as soon as it works, you stop. You are not going to, if you get the state-of-the-art result over ImageNet, you are not going to investigate even more. You are going to quickly tweet or write a blog post or whatever, or publish an archive paper with the result. The second level is meta-parameter overtuning. So what I just described, it is that you are going to optimize all your parameters again and again until you get a good error on the test set. The third one would be dataset selection, where you have a good method and you test it on a first. You are convinced it's a fantastic idea. You test it on a first dataset, does not work. Second dataset does not work. Third dataset, it works now, and this is what you publish. So people would be surprised why you are testing your thing on this very exotic dataset of spiders, and it's because you tried on ImageNet and in CIFAR it did not work, so you went to spider dataset. Even worse is algorithm dataset specific clauses. So it's something you can find in some GitHub repository where you download the reference piece of code and you realize that they have hard-coded special piece of code for certain datasets. And finally, what is probably the worst is random seed selection, where you run multiple run of your thing and you just publish the code and publish results for the seed 134, which was the one that gave you best results. In practice, good conferences are quite demanding regarding experiment, and of course are biased against complicated pipelines. So if you see that somebody comes with a very, very weird way of processing the data, you can be very suspicious that he tried a bunch of stuff before doing this, and he tried until he got reasonable results. And the way the community addresses this issue of meta overfitting is to, of course, first having accessible implementations to prevent this very obvious way of cheating, but also to force you to use reference dataset. That would be to avoid your dataset selection. Leaderboards to avoid any kind of tuning over the test set. So leaderboards are websites where you submit predictions and you never have access to the test labels. Which you can still cheat with it, because you could use if it's image recognition, for instance, you could do it by hand as a human, but still it's a good way to prevent people from cheating too much. Another way is to publish a test set just before the conference deadline, for instance, so that people cannot overtune their algorithm. And finally, a trend we see quite generally is that communities tend to have benchmarks that they upgrade every year or so that there is no overtuning over one version of it. So the last part of this lecture is about two simple clustering and embedding algorithms. So deep learning models, as we will see in later courses, combine embeddings, which are projection of signal into a different space, and dimension reduction operations to extract meaningful information from potentially very large dimension signal. So those sequences of processing parameterize and reparameterize multiple times the signal to make it more and more invariant and interpretable. So you want in some way to go from something where you have a lot of nuisance parameters, like changes in images, changing in illumination, changes in geometric pose, in facial expression for faces, body poses for people detection. And for the sound, it's the same. You have changes in accent, in the sound source, in echo, in many different things. And you want to go from this crude signal to a very refined signal, which basically does not depend on all those nuisances. And to get an intuition of how this is possible, we are going to see here two very standard algorithms. One is k-means, which is an algorithm to do clustering, which is to group samples by more homogeneous subgroups, and principal component analysis, which is a way of finding an affine structure in a data set to see it as a affine manifold. And we are going to illustrate those methods on two favorite data sets. So one is MNIST, a bunch of handwritten digits, and the other one is CIFAR, a bunch of small RGB images. So we start with k-means. So given a bunch of training points in RD, a bunch of vectors, the k-mean algorithm tries to find a bunch of centroids, which are points in the same space, such that they span uniformly the training population, or in another way, such that every sample is close to one of the centroids. If we are able to do this, then the centroids, knowing the closest centroid to a point, is a very good summary of the vector itself. So you, instead of having to transmit the flow values on code the vector, you could say, oh, I'm the closest to centroid 13, and knowing the position of centroid 13, this is a good information in a Euclidean sense, because now you know well where you are in space for a very small bit of information. And the standard algorithm to do this is called Lloyd's algorithm, and it solves k-means approximately. So it tries to minimize this quantity, which is it tries to find the k-centroids, which are vectors in the same space, such that when you sum over all your samples the distance, the square distance to the closest centroid for every sample, this is minimal. And the way Lloyd's algorithm works is first to initialize the centroid uniformly at random. Uniformly or according to another recipe, there are plenty of variants. And then repeat until convergence. You compute for every training example the closest centroid. So it's for, since we are going through iteration t, the centroid closest to sample n will be knt. And then you update every centroid by taking the average of all the points, of all the training points which have been associated to it. Again, so at every iteration, each sample is associated to its closest centroid cluster. And each centroid is updated then, and each centroid is updated to the average of the sample cluster. So let's take this example here, where those are the training points. So they are in the plan, it's a sinusoid line. And here I initialize the centroids, so I initialize 10 centroids at random, uniformly in the plan. Again, this can be done differently. You can, for instance, pick a sample at random instead of taking uniformly in the space, and there are more fancy ways of doing this. And now what I show here with the color are clusters. So all those points are associated to this guy, all those points are associated to this guy, all those points are probably associated to this guy, etc. And all those yellow points are associated to this guy. There is a technical point, which is what do we do with centroids which are associated to nobody? Because when we update each centroid to the average of the points associated to it. Here what I do is that if a centroid is associated to nobody, I just take the clusters which are the largest, and I split them in two at random and put two centroids at random. And then if we iterate, we re-associate every training points to a centroid and re-update each centroid to the average of the point, we get this kind of dynamics, where the points get more and more centered to the cluster to which they are associated. And in the end, we get something quite nice. We get indeed that the centroids are very well dispatched in the training population. So now we can apply that algorithm to images from NIST or CIFAR by considering images as vectors. So a NIST image is 28 to 28 float values, so it's a vector of R784. And the CIFAR image is 32, 32, 3, which is 3072 dimensions. And also we can visualize centroids as images, so we can map an image to a vector or vector to an image just by reshaping the thing. In what follows, I'm going to show k-means done either per class or for all the class mix. So here it's k-means for one centroid, so it's the average. So here you have the 10 classes from NIST, and the last row is going to be the centroids for all the class put together. And what we see is really nice because, for instance, if we have only two centroids, we see that we capture the two types of zeros and two types of ones. And the more we put centroids, the more we have a nice presentation of the data. And it is quite impressive that with 32 centroids, we see that we really capture different types of zeros, we really capture different types of ones with this guy, for instance, or this guy. We really capture different types of two. And it's even better that even the classes themselves are dispatched in different centroids. So we really have some centroids have moved to span the zeros, so this guy, for instance, or this guy, or this guy, and other centroids are spanning the 9s and the 2s, etc. So if we see this result, we are quite enthusiastic about k-means. It looks like it can really capture the structure of the data. But what this experiment shows more is that NIST is a simple data set, because now if we go to CIFAR and we do exactly the same stuff, so here I have my 10 CIFAR classes, and here I have all of them together. Here the centroids are color images. We see that even with 32 centroids, we just get completely meaningless blobs. For some of the data set, we get something, so it's probably cars. Some cases are degenerated, where here there was probably a single image in this cluster, and the centroid is equal to the image. But overall, we see more that the images were highly biased. So the horses, we have image of horses, white horses, which are just a head, or full OD horses where you see them from far away, but we know it's quite bad. So what the very good behavior we saw on NIST is really not reflected into CIFAR. The second algorithm that we are going to see today is PCA, which is a principal component analysis. And similarly, it aims at extracting refined information that captures the structure. So for k-means, we were doing this by having clusters, and the index of the cluster the closest to you would reflect really well where you are. In the PCA, the principal component analysis, we are going to find an affine subspace, which is a point on a basis, so that if we express a certain point in the basis, so if we project it on the affine space spanned by this basis, this point will be close to the original one. So we are going to try to find an affine structure which is as close as possible to all the points of the training set. So if we have a bunch of training points from RD, what we do first is to compute the average, and we center the data. So we start at iteration 0, the starting value is going to be each xn is recentered so that the average of those guys is going to be 0. And now what we do is that at every iteration we look for the direction, so with a vector of norm 1, such that we have maximum variance in this direction. Since they are centered, the variance is simply the sum of the square of the dot product between the vector on the sample, on the training point. And what we look at is the direction of maximum dispersion, which makes sense. If you want to build the manifold, the affine submanifold that is as close as possible to all points, you pick the direction where you have the most dispersion. And then what we do is that we subtract to every point its part which is projected over the manifold we have built so far, and we go on. So we first center the data, and at every iteration we pick the direction where the residual of the data disperse the most. In practice, it's not how it's done, even if this is, I think, a very intuitive way for envisioning PCA. In practice, what you do is that if big X is a matrix of row vector, so the one you would have in a standard tensor with the first index being the sample index, you have this expression, you have that the sum over n of the square of the dot product between V and xn, you can rewrite it as this quantity. So V time X transpose X time V transpose. And I won't do the derivation here, but I like this little derivation because it's very simple. You can maybe do it offline. But it shows that there is a strong relation between the proper direction to reduce the variance on this, the eigenvalues of this guy. Because now, if I say that I want a V of norm 1 such that V times this times Vt is maximal, if you look at the eigendecomposition of this guy, you would get that in the eigenbasis, you want V to be basically the eigenvector of maximum of greatest eigenvalue. So in the end, what you have to remember is that to compute the PCA basis in order, so the vector of the greatest importance, and the second one, third one, etc., what you do is that you compute the eigendecomposition of xtx, where x is the matrix of row vectors of your training examples sorted by as rows, and you compute the eigenvectors and eigenvalues, you rank the eigenvectors according to the absolute value of the eigenvalues, and the one with the greatest value is the first vector of the PCA basis, the second one is the second vector of the PCA basis, etc. So in practice, on a toy example, it looks like this. Imagine I have those points. This would be the average, the mean value of my training points, and this is the direction of maximum dispersion. And of course, because I have only 2 dimensions, the other one has to be orthogonal. Well, in general, it's orthogonal, but it has no other choice than being this guy. So now, as for PCA, we can apply, as for k-mean, sorry, we can apply that algorithm for 2 images from NIST and CIFAR by considering them as vectors. So for any sample x on any t, which is how many dimensions we are going to use, we can compute this guy. So you give me x, I first start from the average over all the training example, and then I add 1 dimension, 2 dimensions, etc. And we are going to look at how well we reconstruct the images. So here, this is on the ones, the images of ones from NIST. This is the average image of ones. And this is the first vector of the PCA basis, which is quite neat because it's really a way of capturing a crude rotation in the plane. Second one would capture a finer rotation in the plane. Third one would capture more translation. Fourth one would capture an even finer rotation in the plane, etc. Fifth would be again a translation, etc. And then this one is probably the thickness of the ones, because you can, if you add it, you add some pixels on the left, on the right, etc. And now what we can do is to take one example, and if we add 0 dimension, 1 dimension, 2 dimension, 3 dimension, etc. So if we add 0 dimension, we start from the average for everybody, and we see that quickly, with only 12 dimensions, we are basically able to reconstruct our digits. And same for the 9, if we do exactly the same stuff, we start from the average, and the more we add vectors, the more we increase the dimension of the space, the PCA space in which we project, the more we're able to reconstruct the signal. So again, this, you may leave this result by saying, oh, it's fantastic, PCA is doing the stuff, I don't need deep learning. But again, if we move to CIFAR, which is slightly more demanding, we see that it's another story. So this is on the horse. This is a PCA basis, which is quite weird. We see that it does something. Here, this for me is what is very interesting with those experiments, is that we should leave convinced that it's definitely not enough. PCA and k-means are not doing the thing. We are not going to build strong AI with PCA and k-means. But still, it's quite impressive, because with only 12 dimensions, we are able to reconstruct something. So this is bad, but this definitely people may recognize a horse or this or that, that definitely. And if we do for the cats, for the cats, I always see this guy, it looks so much like a frog. We see that, again, the basis is very bad, so yeah, it's very hard to capture all the variations in cat images with an affine structure of 12 dimensions, but we are able to still to capture raw color and stuff like that. So for the cats, because they have more variations in pose, it's definitely not as good as for the horses. So what is the conclusion of all this? So those results show that even crude embedding, because those techniques are very, very simple, capture something meaningful. So for NIST, they definitely capture something, and for CIFAR, they capture a bit of information. They obviously capture changes in pixel intensity, but they also capture, especially it was clear on NIST, deformation in the indexing space, so in the image plane. And for me, I don't know, maybe for you it's obvious, but I don't find clear at all that by having a linear structure over the pixel values, we can capture the displacement in the indexing space, which is what PCA and NIST was able to do. And what we saw, especially in CIFAR, a bit on NIST, so translation, deformation, damages, representation, and composition is not handled very well at all. So these strengths and those shortcomings provide an intuitive motivation for deep neural networks on the rest of this course, because we would like to have multiple encodings of this sort, which are able to capture and reduce dimension here and there for local structures with limited variability. So again, NIST is a good example. You don't have so much variability for a character, so you are able to capture something with a compressed representation. You would like to have different channels, so to in some way to allow the system to compress and to have a representation for different parts of the signal separately, and you would like to process at multiple scales. And also, last but not least, we would like that computationally our algorithms would not explode on large data sets on large signal, which means that we must have something not super linear. It should not increase more than linearly with the data set or the signal size, and ideally it should even be more efficient than linear. Okay, so this is the end of the lecture. Again, we have a practical session. You can download the PDF file there. And again, if you have any question, please drop me a mail. I would be plenty happy to answer any question by mail or to add stuff in next lecture that I have not addressed in the previous ones. Thanks for your attention.